January 31st was the deadline for Flatland Red Zoners to leave their homes. Thousands have taken the government's offer and their insurance payout and left for good, but a handful of house owners have decided to stay put in the red zone. So what does the future hold for these families, and what are their options to stay, or the government's options to remove them? These are the questions put to today's guest on Point of View, lawyer and advisor to many red zone property owners, Duncan Webb from Lane Neve Lawyers.
Duncan, the end of last month was the deadline for people to leave the red zone, but not all of them have. So what is the legal position of those people who've chosen to stay?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I've had many red zone people come in and say, what are my options? Do I have to take the offer? And I always start with saying, well, you don't have to leave, but here's the issues you want to think carefully about before you stay. The issues usually aren't the practical issues. It's not generally water and electricity and sewage. Those are things which it's going to be difficult for the suppliers to cut off because of the expectations of the people that are living there. More complicated perhaps are the insurance and banking issues that insurers are not, although they haven't said outright they'll never insure a red zone property, they think very carefully before they do, and it generally requires it's not an off-the-rack arrangement. And if you haven't got insurance, finance is very hard to get. You're in breach of your mortgage if you haven't got insurance.
So if you had a mortgage on a red zone property that you were staying in, that could create serious issues? That could
create some problems. So the bank could say, well, we're not going to continue to let you have that money unless and until you get insurance for the house. And of course, if you're stuck with a red zone property, the last thing you want is a mortgagee sale.
Although, could you have a mortgagee sale of a could someone who's still in a red zone property actually sell it?
Yeah, look, as time passes, I think the thing you've got to remember is that properties were red zoned for all kinds of different reasons. And without getting into the politics of it, some of them were red zoned because the land was hopeless. And those properties are probably not saleable. Other properties were red zoned because of where they were, the difficulty to get to, the difficulty to effect repairs to the infrastructure and things like that. And those properties may be on sound land, there may be nothing wrong with them, and or rockfall is another one where once you sort out the rockfall or you recognise the risk is diminishing over time, then the properties may be perfectly satisfactory to live in. And insurance may be secured, for example, for those properties for everything except rockfall. And it may be that that's satisfactory insurance for a bank. So yeah, there's still a market for red zone properties out there, and as time passes, I think probably more so, once people learn a bit more about what that property in particular is like.
I suppose if that's a summation for people who've perhaps still got mortgages, but what about those people who perhaps don't have a mortgage and therefore owe nothing to the bank anyway?
Yeah.
Are they in a better or a strong position to stay put in the red zone?
Well, they are, because the bank can't dictate to them what they need to do. They may be uninsured, or the insurance they can get may be not as comprehensive as perhaps most people would be comfortable with. But look, that's a decision. There are people out there who can make that decision and say, I'll live with that risk, and this is the house I've always wanted, and it's situated on the piece of land I want to die on, and they're not really that worried about resale and all those kinds of things. And they're the kind of people that are choosing to stay in the red zone, and that's a perfectly reasonable choice to make.
Are they likely to have their services cut off, do you think? I mean, just as an example, we've talked to David Ayres, Mayor of Waimak District, about red zoned areas in Karaki, and he's kind of indicated that they have no immediate plan to kind of cut off services there. Is that like, what do you think will happen in Christchurch?
Well, I think it's unlikely that services will be cut off. There may be isolated incidents where that occurs, but if you've got water and sewage and electricity in particular, it's very difficult for a supplier to unsupply you. Anyone who's tried to get power to them knows the difficulty that can entail, it's equally as hard for the supplier to essentially say we're taking the wires back. Water and sewerage, again, if they're there already, it's very difficult for the council to say we've changed our minds. What was a serviced property is now becoming an unserviced property. That certainly was the plan, that there would be, and clearly large parts of the city will have services cut off because there's no longer going to be houses there that need it. But where there is a house that needs it, I think the council will run into some difficult problems, because that becomes tantamount to, it radically diminishes the value of the property, and that becomes essentially a taking from the person by the council, and that's problematic.
Is it also problematic because if the council's not supplying services, then can they charge a rate?
Well, they can charge a rate, but the rate's got to be different. Because we know that where there's rural properties, there's rural rates, and those properties are not often not serviced to the same extent. Rubbish collection would be another example. So the value of the property, the nature of the property, but of course there is no rating category of red zone properties, and that's caused issues of itself. So yeah, I think rates, yes, but I would have thought the rates would have to reflect the services that are being delivered.
Would they also have to reflect the fact that the land, in theory, because it's been red zoned, is either of marginal value, no value, or an indeterminate value, and consequently the house on it, if it can't be insured and you can't get a mortgage on it, therefore presumably also has a value of firewood rather than as a dwelling?
Those things are all relevant valuation questions, and of course in the next month or so we will be getting new valuations for our properties, and it will be very interesting to see exactly how the nature of the land is reflected in the valuation. One of the interesting things about that valuation is that the government has insisted that they be valued at pre-earthquake state, so an undamaged state, on the basis, and you're frowning, and I can see why. I mean, it's a very it's very difficult for someone who's got a house which is severely damaged and doesn't have the utility that it has, and if they were to sell it tomorrow, just the house, they'd get a much diminished value, to be told that it's worth a great deal more for rating purposes. The reason, or the rationale of the government, is that the house doesn't get sold by itself, it gets sold with its insurance rights, and the right is to have it fixed. So they're essentially presuming that the house has been fixed and that the insurer has paid out, and any money that's been paid has been applied to fixing the house. So that's the thinking behind it, but it doesn't always, I think, add up for the people who are sitting there in their broken houses.
Well, no, but it also doesn't add up, does it, where the homeowner takes the money, doesn't fix up the house, and then gets sold as an as-is, where-is kind of thing, and the person buying it buys it knowing it's an as-is, where-is, but they've got this valuation that says the property is worth X amount of dollars more because it's already been, in theory, fixed up. I mean, that seems peculiar to say the least.
I mean, all I can say about that is you're right. The fact of the matter is that whilst most houses are being fixed, at least to some extent, there are a bundle, a sizable chunk of houses which people are settling their insurance claims, taking the money, selling the house, and essentially turning all of their assets into cash. And those houses will be valued as if they'd been fixed. It isn't it's a blunt tool, to say the least.
So should we expect, therefore, that when those valuations are released, there will be lots of people seeking to have them reviewed in that case, or questioning the level of rates that they're going to be charged?
You can seek to have them reviewed, but the difficulty is that there's been regulatory change to say this is how the rating exercise is to be carried out, which is difficult. The valuer will have to apply those rules.
So is that, I take it then, that's a different approach to the valuations than has been taken in the past?
Well, the valuation, rateable values, or the rating valuation exercises has never been fine-tuned, and they'll always say this is for the purposes of rating, not to give you an actual sale value of your house. And people will, complain that they drive past or they don't visit at all. And the reason for that is they're just trying to get a very loose estimate of your house to put it in the right band to levy the right rate. So in that sense, the value of the house probably in some cases won't be greatly affected by earthquake damage, but if it is serious damage, foundation damage and so on, damage which affects the livability of the home, it would have a significant impact. And there is an argument that this exercise will lead to some overvaluation. One of the interesting things about the whole red zone exercise was that it was it was pitched as a voluntary acquisition, although a lot of people think it was a little less than voluntary, if not quite compulsory. Now, and one of the reasons for that was the CERA only has the power to acquire land that's necessary for the recovery. And now, some of that land probably was necessary for the recovery, but others of it is mere convenience. So if you've got a house that's sitting out in an island, a little red zoned island, and CERA or the City Council wants to acquire it, if it's CERA, they've got to show that it's necessary to acquire that last house for the recovery. It's going to be very hard to show that.
So what are the government or CERA's options to remove the remaining red zoners?
One of the interesting things about the whole red zone exercise was that it was it was pitched as a voluntary acquisition, although a lot of people think it was a little less than voluntary, if not quite compulsory. Now, and one of the reasons for that was the CERA only has the power to acquire land that's necessary for the recovery. And now, some of that land probably was necessary for the recovery, but others of it is mere convenience. So if you've got a house that's sitting out in an island, a little red zoned island, and CERA or the City Council wants to acquire it, if it's CERA, they've got to show that it's necessary to acquire that last house for the recovery. It's going to be very hard to show that. So they can't just swan in and say it's convenient to us to take that. So there's difficulties there. The council would have to use the Public Works Act, which is even more tightly constrained because they have to show it's necessary for some kind of public work. Now, a park can be a public work. Maybe that's one route, but I suspect that the problem's not that large. These houses, they're not going to cause too many problems. And then they may, sitting out there amongst the trees and grass, it's not a huge issue, I don't think.
So you're not anticipating CERA or government to be about to announce sweeping moves to try and clear the red zones in the short term at least?
No, for two reasons, I think. One is probably not necessary. If they want to acquire the houses, they can probably wait. They've got the government can wait a long, long time. It needn't be in a rush. And I guess the other reason, it'd be pretty unpalatable because it was always pitched as a voluntary offer. And if they then come in and say, fooled you, we're going to buy the house, and they'd have to then buy it at market valuation, whatever that might be, then that would be a significant shift from the way they've treated everyone else, and that's a real risk.
Well, speaking of risks, I'm interested in whether there's any risk to the government or to CERA with people who took the red zone offers and left because they thought it was compulsory, they didn't have a choice, the services were going to be cut off, whatever conclusions they came to. And they're now looking at their neighbours who went, no thanks, we'll stay here, who are still there.
Yeah.
Do those people have any recourse to say, well, I want to go back now, thanks very much, I don't want your offer? I'm thinking, for example, of people in perhaps like Brooklands, where there seems to be no plan to remediate, and in Karaki, to use that example again, where the Waimakere District Council has indicated they've got no plans to cut any services off.
Yeah. Do they have a gripe? Yes, they have a gripe. Do they have a claim? It's quite a different question. And I think it's quite difficult to say that they do, unless they were genuinely misled. And if you look at the CERA offer, it was very carefully worded because it never said your services will be cut off. It simply said things like the councils or the local bodies cannot guarantee, and it was against, the reality of the situation is when most ordinary people are faced with those kinds of challenges, there were no other real options. It's a very small minority who had the strength of character and the means to turn down the government offer. Although it was never legally a compulsory acquisition, in real terms, most people had no other alternative. And people dealt with, although it was pitched as, here's the offer, it's essentially universal, 2007 valuations, the effect of that in conjunction with insurance rights was very uneven indeed. So some people, and I dealt with people whose government valuations were clearly wrong, but because they hadn't reviewed them at the time, because it wasn't important to them, they never thought it was going to be the sale price of their house. They were faced with a derisory offer, absolute pittance. Whereas other people who had a good valuation and whose houses were seriously damaged, such that they were probably a rebuild, ended up wildly better off than they would have been. Now, that's not unfair. It's not unfair that they're better off because that's what their insurance rights gave them. Yeah. But the unevenness across the red zoned homeowners was a really unfortunate and probably avoidable consequence of the red zone offer.
What about the landowners who are in the red zones who hadn't got round to building, for argument's sake, had bought sections in some places and were planning to, and along came the earthquakes, and then the offer they got was half their the value of.
And of course, that's currently
land.
Still under appeal.
Yes.
The Fowler and Outcasts case. Look, the thinking behind that offer was, well, if you don't get insurance, and if you haven't got a dwelling on the property, there's no EQC that goes with it, and therefore the government, when it's acquiring it, is acquiring less because it's not acquiring the EQC claim. And for those people who had houses that were uninsured, the other 50% offer cases, there was a sense that we shouldn't be encouraging people to be uninsured. We shouldn't be giving the same benefits to them. Now, the interesting thing about the court's view of that was the fact that the court said they weren't relevant considerations in making, because of course the only reason, as I said before, that you can acquire land and exercise powers of purchase is to effect the recovery, not to punish people for not having insurance. So the response of the court was, well, your offer might or might not be appropriate, but go away, think about it again, and come back with an offer that's made for the right reasons.
And so where is that now in terms of a timeline then? So that's...
Well, it's still, as I understand it, it's going on appeal to the Supreme Court for further clarification. The 50%, the Outcasts and Fowler Developments and what have you, they, in my view, won that case. Interestingly, they're also the appellants because it appears they think they didn't win it enough. So while that all appears to be on hold whilst it's determined whether or not that appeal will proceed, because they have to get leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. I doubt we'll see red zones as a way of life, but what the council in particular is facing is a massive flood management problem. And one of the real issues, so the red zone, no. I think the last, the Rockfall red zones in December were probably the last we'll see, because Sarah's plan to retire huge tranches of land is essentially, I hope, complete, and it would be politically very difficult indeed to say, oh, and by the way, we've changed our mind again about what we'll red zone. But the flood management issue is massive. There is clearly a very significantly increased risk of flooding in some places. It is arguable that in some areas there are houses which should have been red zoned that weren't, and I'm thinking of some around the Dallington Dudley Creek catchment area which are routinely flooding and flooding very seriously indeed.
If the red zone land can be successfully remediated, is there any legal or moral obligation on Sarah or the government to offer that land back to its previous owners?
Yeah, there's if land's acquired under the Public Works Act, there is an offer back obligation. So you've got to offer that. If once you've finished using it for the airport or whatever it might be, or the community hall, you've got to offer it back to the people you got it from or their successors. The SERA Act, no such requirement, which is one of the complaints about that Act, that the government can come in the central city is a good example, designate land, acquire it compulsorily, and then sell it back to different people at a profit. Now, in respect of the red zoned land, it wasn't compulsorily acquired, so even if there was an offer back provision in the SERA Act, you still wouldn't get the benefit of that. So the short answer is no. In law, there's no obligation to offer remediated land back to the people who owned it. The other issue with it would be the fact that all of the multitude of tiny parcels of land, which would make it administratively very difficult, because one of the problems is, if you're putting parks and so on into different services, and you'll be breaking it up again. So it would be difficult. Is there, is there a moral obligation? Should it be offered back to the people in light of the fact that it was acquired in some cases at clear undervalue? 2007, there's still red zoned offers being finalised now. There's the last tranche that were red zoned in December, so there's still red zone offers out there. They're not all finalised. Valuations that are 7 years old and are rating valuations, not real valuations. It's clear undervalue. Yes, there is a moral obligation to say, well, actually, we can hand this land back, to hand it back to the people from whom it was acquired, on terms which are equally advantageous.
Have we seen the last of the red zones, do you think? I mean, one of the consequences of the earthquakes has been that the level of the estuary has been pushed up, for example, and the Avon's banks have fallen in and its bed's been pushed up. There are now much larger areas at risk of flooding, and in fact are flooding on a fairly regular basis. There's some TC3 areas where the rebuild is going to require the houses to be lifted up on their foundations much higher. One wonders if, in fact, red zones are going to become a bit of a way of life into the future.
Look, I doubt we'll see red zones as a way of life, but what the council in particular is facing is a massive flood management problem. And one of the real issues, so the red zone, no. I think the last, the Rockfall red zones in December were probably the last we'll see, because SERA's plan to retire huge tranches of land is essentially, I hope, complete, and it would be politically very difficult indeed to say, oh, and by the way, we've changed our mind again about what we'll red zone. But the flood management issue is massive. There is clearly a very significantly increased risk of flooding in some places. It is arguable that in some areas there are houses which should have been red zoned that weren't, and I'm thinking of some around the Dallington-Dudley Creek catchment area which are routinely flooding, and flooding very seriously indeed. So, I mean, that's a real problem. When it comes to insurance, there's an interface between what counts, between the repairs being undertaken, between the building regulations, and between the consenting process at council, which is very complex, and it's in the insurer's interest to minimise the cost of a repair, and raising a house up above flood risk levels can be very expensive, and so there's a motive on their part to find a repair solution which doesn't require a consent and doesn't require a foundation replacement, and therefore need only comply as much as before. But it's any homeowner in a flood management area, particularly below the 50-year flood return level, I would say take very careful advice about the nature and extent of your repairs.